Hello, hello. How's everybody doing?
Hi, good. How are you?
Good, good.
Hi, doing good.
Great. So we have here Gene Chance and Savannah Wilson from Florida Institute of Technology presenting Time to Act, that is ACT, an acronym using behavior analytic exercises based on acceptance and commitment therapy to improve esports player communication. So whoever is sharing their screen, let's go ahead and do that, and then we will get going.
All right. Everything looking good on your end?
It's looking great and we can hear you fine. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for attending Jean and I's presentation. As Dr. Seth Jenny just mentioned, it is time to act using behavior analytic exercises based on acceptance and commitment therapy to improve esports player communication.
Hi everyone. My name is Jean Chance. I come from a background in traditional sports. I grew up a competitive figure skater who competed regionally, nationally, and internationally. I am very fascinated by behavior analytic applications within sports settings, and I've actually spent the last year and a half applying that lens to esports. I will also be giving a presentation on ethics and esports at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday.
And I am Savannah Wilson. I also came from a traditional sports background, specifically rowing. I experienced a severe lack of support, specifically as a collegiate student athlete, and have spent the last 3 years working to supply that support to our esports athletes. I recently received the NACE Student Leadership Award, which I am very honored by, and that is my photo there.
So to start, acceptance and commitment therapy is a therapeutic approach that helps people move past negative thoughts by accepting their thoughts and emotions as valid and committing to change that aligns with these values. Throughout acceptance and commitment therapy, there are 6 pillars, including acceptance, cognitive diffusion, being present, self as context, values, and committed actions. So, very commonly, acceptance and cognitive diffusion are commonly paired together. Acceptance itself is the process of acknowledging feelings and emotions that are happening and accepting that they're there and then actively moving past them. Think of it as acknowledging the elephant in the room. Whereas in cognitive diffusion, players are actively diffusing themselves away from their negative thoughts about themselves. In present moment and self and context, which are both also commonly paired together, being present in the moment is the focus on what is actively in the environment and what's actively happening in front of you. Self as context includes the identification of self thoughts and then recognizing the difference between these thoughts as being fact or simply just a thought. In values and committed actions, values themselves are identified, and then committed actions or specific behaviors are later identified in order to understand how behavior can act in a way that aligns with the selected values. So acceptance and commitment therapy is overall a behavior analytic based therapeutic practice created by Stephen Haynes in the 1980s. ACT provides measurable behavior change exercises and also measures private covert behaviors such as self-talk.
Getting into the data collection. So we completed data collection across 8 different Rocket League players, as well as 1 team manager. For time's sake, we will not be going over all of that data today, but we pulled the most interesting data for you guys. It is also across a lot of time. This is a very long, ongoing study. So across 3 different semesters, we've been intervening with the Rocket League players at our college. And so this is going across spring, fall, and spring semesters. This is also across several different team changes. We've had several players move from junior varsity to varsity or vice versa. We've also had some players leave. We've had players graduate, also substitutions, on a game by game basis. And overall, we measured 2 behaviors, negative self-talk and positive statements. So negative self-talk is largely defined as any verbal behavior that expresses apologies, self-deprecation, and or unproductive narrations of gameplay. So some examples of that are repeating, I'm sorry, or I don't know why I can't just put the ball in the net. That would be an example of self-deprecation and an unproductive narration of gameplay. A non-example would be a simple acknowledgement of something that went poorly, such as, my bad. Then we also looked at positive statements, which is also verbal behavior, and that it expresses gratitude, self-praise, and or productive narrations of gameplay. So examples of this could be, hey, thank you, or that was awesome, or next time I'll make sure I cover the backboard, being productive discussions of the gameplay at hand. A non-example would be, nice shot, after their teammate missed the goal, right? So we have to take into account the affect or tone of voice that the players are using when saying these things. In writing, nice shot looks like it would be positive, but in actuality, in the context in which it is said, it is not positive. It is meant as deprecating towards their teammates. So we're going to do a little bit of graph orientation here. The data that you see here on your screen is actually from our team manager. We only have the 2 data points because he very rarely plays. We have substitutions for a reason. If our team manager is playing, it's either for fun or the very, very last resort. So the x-axis here is going to be a given practice. The y-axis is going to be the rate per minute. So you're going to see some smaller numbers because that is the rate per minute. Keep that in mind here. We have our phase labels. You're going to see baseline, and then you're going to see a couple of letters. Those are going to be in shorthand, and we will describe those to you as they come up. For example, PM and VCA is present moment and values and committed actions. You're going to see a phase change line anytime we move from baseline to a new ACT intervention or from one ACT intervention into another. You will also see phase change lines between the passage of time. So from fall semester into spring semester. We put these phase change lines in largely to indicate that there has been a long break in between the data paths, as well as indicate that there's likely been some changes made to the varsity and junior varsity rosters. And then the key is going to change, but overall, our data paths are going to be green and orange and black. And I will make sure to point those out in our next more complicated graph. So getting into the data here, we're going to start with our low performers. So as you can see, there are 2 different graphs on your screen. On the left-hand side of the screen is going to be NST, or negative self-talk. On the right-hand side of the screen is going to be PS, or positive statements. So we want that PS graph to be much higher than the NST graph. For visual interpretation of the data, the y-axis and x-axes are going to be the exact same. So from practice 1 through 15 on the x-axis, and then from 0 to 4 on the y-axis for this individual. Each individual's graphs will adjust to provide the best visual analysis of the data. So as we can see here, across the top, we have PMS, meaning present moment, spring semester, PMF, present moment, fall semester, VCA, values and committed actions. I'm not going to announce the phases changing from here on. You guys can read those yourself as I go through the data. So the first comment that I'd like to make about this performer is that as we got into the use of present moment, we saw a steady decrease in his negative self-talk near 0 levels, and that maintained into the transition of values and committed action, which is really what we want to see. Some areas that were of concern with this player and why he's identified as a low performer is that we had these massive dips in the data, regardless of where we were in intervention. So as you can see in the boxes highlighted here for practices 5, 8, 9, and 14, this individual experienced some severely low dips in their positive statements. Moving on to our next low performer, AY, we have much more data for this performer. So first and foremost, I'd like to draw our attention to the steady increase in positive statements that has occurred ever since we intervened with this player. So across semesters, both spring and fall, as you can see, as well as across interventions, present moment, values, and committed action, we can see a steady increase here, which is really awesome to see. And For the green line versus the black line, the green line is going to be positive statements when they are winning, and the black line is going to be positive statements when they are losing. So while there is some separation in those data paths, we'd like them to be as close as possible because we don't want our players only speaking positively when they are winning and then engaging in a lot of negative self-talk when they are losing, which is most commonly seen in players across the board, regardless of title. So that is the distinction there. So we would like to see these data paths come a little bit closer together so that we can see positive statements across wins and losses. There are a couple of points where the data paths cross, which is actually a very good thing. Frequently, you don't want your data paths to cross. You want there to be a very clean distinction. But what that means here is that regardless of the fact that he is losing, he is still speaking super positively, so much more positively than when he is winning. And that happens in both data point 21 and 24, which is really awesome to see. Moving on to our next player here, we see baseline levels are pretty consistent and very close together. As you can see, the red boxes outlining the data paths show a little bit of overlap in these data paths. So don't love the overlap between negative self-talk and positive statements. We do want positive statements to be significantly higher than negative self-talk. And we see that once we intervene. So once we bring in that intervention, positive statements gets higher, negative self-talk gets lower, and that is what we want to see, is a more distinct difference across these two graphs here. We also see a lot more of the black and green lines and the black and orange lines crossing, touching, being next to or near each other. In baseline, there was a very distinct, when I am losing, I have more negative self-talk and I have less positive statements, as indicated by a higher black line on baseline for negative self-talk and a lower black line for positive statements in baseline. We don't see that in intervention. Once we intervened, those lines were crisscrossing all over the place, which is absolutely phenomenal to see because that actually means that our player is becoming more consistent with their verbal vocal behavior in game. Moving on to our high performers, we wanted to include some high performer data sets to showcase that while there is not necessarily a reason to intervene with our high performers, intervening or including them in group intervention with these ACT exercises does not hurt their performance levels. So as we can see here, throughout the entirety of the data, we see very, very, very consistent data paths. So negative self-talk is extremely low, near zero levels. Positive statements is really high up there, up in the 6s, 5s, and 4s, and that's an average rate per minute. And for Rocket League, it is 5 minutes per game on average. We did average out the OT time if they did go into overtime. We do have some new players. So we have some smaller data sets to show you. So with baseline for our player here, AN, we saw relatively low levels of negative self-talk, and we saw decently high levels for positive statements. But as you can see, specifically in baseline of his positive statements, there's a downward trend starting from 2 all the way down to 5. We see that he is getting less and less positive. Luckily, he's not getting more negative. The negative self-talk is maintaining at near zero levels, but we do want to increase those positive statements, which is why we introduced present moment and values and committed actions. We saw a very large increase in his positive statements following these exercises. So even with our new players who don't have a bunch of rapport with us, who have not worked with the team, this is a new environment, there's lots of extra variables happening. Even these new players, these exercises are working very well for them, and we are seeing an increase in their positive statements behavior. We have another new player. This is one of our substitutes, BI. So in baseline levels, you can see that his positive statements and his negative self-talk were basically at the same level, that data point 1, basically at the same level. But once we intervene with present moment and values and committed actions, we can see a large jump for the positive statements. And we see a slight decrease in the negative self-talk, which is absolutely amazing to see. So as a reminder, with the new players, it works regardless of the rapport that we've built, regardless of the new environment that they are in. So this works for new players. And for the experienced players who are very good, high performers, you appreciate where their verbal vocal behavior is at. This doesn't hurt. You can still teach them these exercises. They can take it outside of Rocket League and apply it elsewhere. And then for your low performers, it really does help. It really does help stabilize the data. So you're getting more consistent verbal behavior from them in game. It helps increase their positive statements as well as decrease their negative self-talk. And we've actually done a little bit of statistical analysis here for you. So we were able to decrease negative self-talk specifically through engaging in present moment. Values and committed actions wasn't as good at decreasing negative self-talk as present moment was. So present moment really helped us decrease our negative self-talk, both across wins and losses. So overall, we saw an average 40% decrease in negative self-talk, and this is averaged across all 8 of our players and our one team manager. So across all 8 of our players, from baseline to present moment, when they experienced that, we saw a 40% decrease, which is huge to see. And then, of course, we want to look at positive statements. Were we able to increase those? And if so, what was the best exercise for doing that? And we found that values and committed actions exercise was the best for increasing positive statements. Across the board, we average increased by 94%. I don't know about you, but that's a lot. It was a huge, huge change for our Rocket League players that we saw, which is absolutely phenomenal to see.
So I wanted to go ahead and walk everyone through what the specific exercises we ran with the players looks like. So for example, in present moment, we asked the players to identify 5 stimuli or items in their environment that are not aversive. So things that were outside of their gameplay. Looking at this picture here, which is the room that the players practice in, they could identify things such as the chair that they're sitting in, the TV on the wall. They could even identify the carpet or the feeling of the air conditioning blowing overhead and through the ceiling, and things of that nature that they can actively see or feel or interact with through the use of their senses in that setting. In values and committed actions, we ask the players to self-identify their team values and then come up with specific actions to take that would align with these values. So for example, with our varsity team, they identified the values of fun, passion, respect, patience, humility, and communication. And then with our junior varsity team, they identified the values of communication, teamwork, accountability, persistence, respect, and fun. And then each of these teams came up with specific behaviors to engage in that align with these values that they selected. So for acceptance, we asked the players to identify their elephant in the room. And as you can see on the screen, these are some of the examples of the elephants in the room that were experienced by our players. So if one player, for example, said that they had homework due, but they didn't know how they were supposed to do it, so they emailed the professor, but also figured it out on their own, and they finished it. And then we had one player who addressed that they were really inconsistent, but their teammates tried to cover for them frequently, but they were actively working on becoming more consistent so that the teammates can trust them for going for the ball. So in diffusion, we ask the players to identify thoughts about themselves and then engage in a given exercise to diffuse from this thought. So we actually, for this exercise, had a couple different ways to engage in diffusion. So the first way, we had the players repeat the thought that they had about themselves, repeat it over and over and over again until there was no weight carried to it. We also had the players slow down their thought, meaning they would say it in such a long, drawn out way, it could not be understandable. And then the last one, we would ask the players to imagine themselves shipping off their thoughts. So loading that thought up in a cannon, as we can see on the screen here, and then blasting it away. So it's going far away from them. In selfless context, the players were asked to identify thoughts about themselves and then recognize that their thoughts are thoughts about themselves and not truths about themselves. So understanding the difference between those two. And this can commonly be compared to diffusion. However, in selfish context, the goal is to acknowledge the thought as a thought and not a fact. And it is objectively impossible for a human to identify as an abstract concept. So there is no way for a human to be stupid, as we can see on the screen. This is a thought, not a fact. So overall, the use of ACT helps players to be able to move past their negative thoughts by accepting their thoughts and emotions as valid while actively committing to change that aligns with these values. The implementation was found to significantly improve communication with all of our esports players. And some important statistics to note were that the negative self-talk among players decreased by 40%, and then positive statements increased from our players by 94% post-intervention. And according to the coaches and all of the coaching staff, this was very socially valid. The coaching staff that we worked with was very appreciative to have these ACT exercises within their coaching tool belt. And then these were the references that we cited while actively working through the use of ACT.
And then we also have our contact information. You can scan this QR code for our bios as well as our LinkedIn accounts. So feel free to DM us on LinkedIn. And we will now take any questions and discussion from the audience. Question 1. Do you believe that negative self-talk is more prevalent with more competitive or casual players? And do you have a theory/explanation as to why that might be? Very good question. I think that negative self-talk is most prevalent in environments that do not support positive self-talk. Often that is a more competitive environment. However, I know of several competitive teams who work around the clock to ensure that their athletes are very well supported, even engaging in, self-affirmations, other ACT-based exercises, even if they don't know that they're ACT-based, they frequently are. So I think that there might be a little bit more support for, unfortunately, negative self-talk in competitive environments. But also recognizing that certain environments in casual play could be deemed as toxic, right? And in a toxic environment, you're more likely to talk down on yourself and not talk positively because everyone around you is also talking down about themselves or even talking down about you as a player. Great question. Jean, anything further to add on that?
I think you summed it up beautifully. Absolutely amazing.
Awesome. Question 2 is, what general recommendations do you have for players and then sports psychologists working with esports players based on the results of your research? Jean, you want to take that one?
Sure. I think the recognizing first and foremost when and where, if there is any high rates of negative self-talk versus high rates of positive statement, recognizing when they're happening, where they're happening, and then trying to recognize if there's any kind of correlation or pattern in there. Based on the results of our research, I think evidently so, the use of acceptance and commitment therapy can be very beneficial and would be very beneficial for players as well across other titles.
Yes, I definitely agree. I think that in general, looking at small, quick, easy exercises to incorporate with your athletes would help in any given scenario, especially with LAN environments where you're in a completely new environment. How do we center our athletes? Having these in your tool belt to bring out are really, really awesome.
Mhm.
Question 3, were the ACT interventions delivered on a team level or an individual level? Jean, you want to answer that one?
Sure. So the exercises such as values and committed actions, where the players were actively making those selections as a team. They were working together to create their value, to select their values, and then collectively as a team come up with their committed actions. For some of the other exercises, they were individualized, they were individually completed. So the players would send in their elephant in the room privately, but all of the players would send an elephant in the room. But
Yeah.
the players were not speaking of their elephants in the room amongst each other or in a group message of any kind.
Yeah, great clarification there. Question 4, do you have concerns around scope of practice? Should esports directors be trying to implement these strategies, or should this only be implemented by trained mental health professionals or psychologists/therapists? Good question. Always be worried about scope of practice and ethical implementation and dissemination of science wherever that might take you, but especially to esports, since there is such little amount of research out there, which is why opportunities like this are so phenomenal to get together as researchers. To answer the question, I would say that you want to make sure that you are receiving mentorship or some level of supervision, and that supervisor or mentor should be within their scope of competency to provide you with help in implementing this. So if you have no one and you would like to implement something like this, I highly recommend you could reach out to us. We have plenty of mentors and supervisors who would be more than happy to get in contact with you and assist in the implementation of this. Question 5, do you think there is any constructive aspects to the negative self-thought, similar to how Michael Jordan would push himself and others around him to reach their full potential? That's a trick question. I think it's a lot of I think what the question is trying to get at is, could something that seems to be negative self-talk secretly be providing reinforcing properties to someone to push them to be a better version of themselves or to push them to reach full potential? The answer is, if you very strategically completed that, possibly. But in actuality, what we see with our esports players and with athletes is no. Negative self-thoughts are not motivating in the way that people think of them to be motivating. They are motivating because they are aversive, meaning you are trying to prove yourself wrong. And that's a very negative mental space to be in, and that results in large negative self-talk and frequently negative talk of other people as well. Any further comments on that, Jean?
I don't have any further comments on that. Nope, I think you summed it
Yeah.
really well. Made some really good points there.
And then I think this will be our last question here, question 6. What recommendations would you suggest to adapt your approach towards youths, specifically 12 years old to 16 years old, participating in esports programs? Great question. I think with middle schoolers, which seems to be the youth that you are speaking of, they are not taught how to label their emotions or how to label, for example, what is a thought versus a fact. As we discussed as self as context, they will say, I'm so stupid, and genuinely in their hearts believe that they are stupid. And you can't be. That's an abstract concept. You're a human being who happens to be engaging in some silly, goofy behaviors. That's okay. So I think having a heart-to-heart conversation with them about what emotions are and how you feel them and how thoughts are not fact. And if you have mean thoughts or bad thoughts or negative thoughts, that's okay. Everybody does. That's completely normal. How do we work towards more positive thoughts? And you can see the thought process change through their verbal behavior, which is really amazing to see. Anything to add, Jean?
No, I think you really summed up really well. Just ensuring that way that the exercises are explained is adapted towards the age range of the players. So perhaps providing more detail into specific information, such as the example in self as context of identifying a thought versus a fact.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Jean and Savannah, for great practical information. Again, that was probably one of the most amount of questions we've had from any of the presentations so far. So the audience was definitely engaged. So we appreciate you taking your time to sharing your research, and we hope that we see you next year at our conference in Japan. So if you can stop sharing,
Yes.
and we can roll into getting set up for the next presenter. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.